How can pornography impact you, your loved ones, and the world around you? Discover the answer for yourself in our free 3-part documentary series, Brain, Heart, World. In 3 30-minute episodes, this docuseries dives into how pornography impacts individuals, relationships, and society. With witty narration and colorful animation, this age-appropriate series shines a hopeful light on this heavy topic. In each episode, you'll hear from experts who share research on porn's harms, as well as true stories from people who have been impacted personally by pornography. Stream the full series for free, or purchase an affordable screening license at brainheartworld.org.
My name is Garrett Jonsson, and you're listening to Consider Before Consuming, a podcast by Fight the New Drug. And in case you're new here, Fight the New Drug is a non-religious and non-legislative organization that exists to provide individuals with the opportunity to make an informed decision regarding pornography by raising awareness on its harmful effects using only science facts and personal accounts. We want these conversations to be educational, uplifting, and hopeful as we sit down with experts, influencers, activists, and people with personal accounts. We cover a wide variety of topics that may be triggering to some. You can refer to the episode notes for a specific trigger warning. Listener discretion is advised. Today's episode is with Phillip Martin from GBH News. He's a senior investigative reporter from the GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting. He's a multi-award-winning journalist. He's the co-author of Unseen. During this conversation, we discuss Unseen, a series that sheds light on the boy victims of the sex trade. With that being said, let's jump into the conversation. We hope you enjoy this episode of Consider Before Consuming.
It's a pleasure meeting you, and so sorry about the being late. I was rushing in on a bike to get back to my desk.
The fact that you rushed in on a bike makes it cool.
Okay. All right.
I'm a big fan of cycling, so.
Okay, good.
When you say, I'm assuming you meant a bicycle, right?
A bicycle, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Not a motorcycle.
I didn't know if Phillip was rolling in on his Harley or his...
I would crash on a Harley.
Okay. Well, we appreciate you joining us, and no problem on, the tardiness. I get it. Sam said that you're always involved in some cool stories, and so, we understand. You're a busy individual.
Yeah, as are you, but and I appreciate the leeway.
So I understand that you have a meeting to be to in about 30 minutes, and so we want to respect that time frame. Before we jump into the conversation, do you have any questions for me?
I don't. I find it absolutely intriguing that you began a podcast on this topic. It's fascinating, and I can see why your audience is as significant as it is, given the attention to this and growing attention to it these days.
Right. Well, we feel fortunate to have you on the podcast today. When we think about victims of the child sex trade, oftentimes we think about girls and young women, but growing evidence suggests that thousands of boys and young men, far more than previously thought, fall victim to commercial sexual exploitation as well. And yourself and your co-worker, Jenifer McKim, is that how you pronounce it?
That's correct, Jenifer McKim.
Jenifer and Phillip are both award-winning reporters for GBH News. For the listeners that aren't familiar with GBH, can you explain what GBH is and where you guys are located?
Yeah, GBH is just a shorthand for the WGBH Educational Foundation. We're a key part of PBS and the public radio system. We put out programs on radio and that include The World and Innovation Hub. And on television, we're responsible for Frontline, Nova, American Experience, many of the programs that you see on PBS, many of the programs you hear on public radio come out of the GBH system. And I work both the local side and occasionally internationally and nationally with the world. And we're based in Boston.
Awesome. I've never been to Boston, but I know that I will make it there at some point in my life. It seems like a beautiful place.
It is indeed.
Well, jumping into what we're talking about today, you and Jenifer, you put out a 2-part series, like I mentioned, titled Unseen. This series shines a light on commercial sexual exploitation, specifically on the boy victims of the sex trade. First off, Phillip, I think it's important to define what is commercial sexual exploitation. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, the shorthand that people use is CSEC. And what it is essentially is when individuals exploit other individuals, quite usually those much younger than them, where there is money involved or some type of contractual or transactional process that is taking place. It's either money or it's housing or it's drugs. It's something in exchange for sex. And the exploitation occurs, of course, because it's usually some more powerful person preying on a less powerful individual. The vast majority of people who are sexually exploited are poor people, disproportionately brown and black, and of course, mainly women. But as you pointed out, Garrett, there's another aspect of this as well, that which is rarely talked about, which is the exploitation of boys. Now, we hear about the super exploitation of children, this grotesque practice by some men around the world who basically engage in child pornography and worse, the rape and abuse of children. Much of this is connected to something that occurs later, which is essentially buying boys and teenagers for money or to allow them to survive, something that's called survival sex. And these things are connected to one another. So that is essentially what commercial sexual exploitation is. It manifests in forms of, it manifests as trafficking, sex trafficking. And sex trafficking, of course, legally means that anyone who is exploited sexually under the age of 18 by someone else, and there's a transaction involved. That's known as trafficking. You don't have to move from point A to point B to go. You don't have to go anywhere to be trafficked, but you can be trafficked because of the transactional aspect of the relationship.
Right. It reminds me of the definition from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, like a commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or like you said, if the person is under the age of 18.
That's correct. Absolutely.
And yeah, I think that there's a lot of nuance here. I think one of the misconceptions is that someone being trafficked, they're taken from their home. But like you mentioned, the reality is that someone can be trafficked and then go home and sleep a night in their own bed.
That's true because of the key word that you used in the legal definition that's taken from the federal statute, which is you used the term coercion. And coercion is a large part of this. As you pointed out, you do find occasionally women and men chained to things like radiators. And occasionally you do find where they cannot leave an apartment or building, or for that matter, a hotel without the permission of the term people use these days, which is a horrible misnomer, is manager. But we're talking about pimps, we're talking about traffickers. And that's where we are today. Movies like Taken have done a disservice. In one sense, it's a service in bringing attention to human trafficking, but a disservice in conveying what that is. Mm-hmm. A conveyance that is so out of the norm, and where it basically, again, does more harm than good, because it's presenting a picture of trafficking that does not that does exist, but certainly does not exist in the way that it is promulgated by these individuals.
Well, jumping back to how this piece, Unseen, started, what was it that sparked a desire for you and Jenifer and GBH to perform this investigation?
Several years ago, I had completed I've focused on trafficking for many years, and one of the pieces I had done was on the illicit massage business. And at that time, a social worker named Stephen Procopio sent me a note and said, "Look, I really appreciate that you're focusing on this issue, but what about the boys?" That was his question. And his question led to us working on this, what is now a two-part series that is ongoing, however. We expect by the end of this series, we will have 7 or 8 parts to this story.
How did you and Jenifer go about or approach this investigation?
We reached out to the anti-human trafficking community, which includes groups like, as you know, Polaris Project, which is now just simply called Polaris, out of Washington, which is the largest think tank and policy organization focused on trafficking. But we also reached out to local organizations that largely deal with the sexual trafficking of women and some labor trafficking. This includes a group called My Life, My Choice in Massachusetts. And then through them, but particularly through Steve Procopio, the social worker, we looked for individuals who have been impacted by this directly. What we found as we approached a lot of the traditional anti-trafficking organizations is that very few of them dealt with boys, dealt with the super exploitation of boys and young men. And that's still the case. We're finding very few deal with them, even though we found that as much as, based on a national study in 2016, as much as 30% of human trafficking cases involve boys and men. It's a surprising statistic. But if you look at a place like Chicago and Atlanta, a significant number of individuals who are engaged who are being prostituted, those who are involved in survival sex, as it's called, those who may be deemed so-called volunteers, and those are people who basically figured this is their lot in life, the rest of their life. But many of them started off as individuals who were exploited before they reached the age of 17. And one of those we interviewed, Garrett, was a young man named Chris Bates, who was 16 years old when he started selling himself. He sold himself on the internet to adult men. He sold himself to former teachers from the prep, I should say the private school he went to. It really wasn't a prep school. It was more of a private school. And within months, and he was 16 at the time, and within months, his reputation grew. And people start seeking him out, men, grown men, many of them ostensibly straight, who were seeking him out for sex. So he's one of the young men we reached out to. He was living in Connecticut at the time, now living in Massachusetts. We also reached out to a young man named Jose Alfaro, who was involved in a very well-known case out of Texas, where he was prostituted at the age of 16 and 17 by a man much older who used him for sex and then sold him to other men. And he essentially escaped one night following a very abusive situation, a situation where he, in fact, was raped by one of the clients. And for years, he's been trying to tell his story. And through GBH, through Jenifer and I, through this series, we've been able to present his story to those, if you will, outside of the LGBTQ community and outside of the traditional human trafficking community that is largely focused on girls and women, and should focus on girls and women. This is not to this is not to take away from that focus, but it's to say that human trafficking is far more complex than any of us ever imagined.
That's a true statement. And we just want to thank Chris Bates and Jose Alfaro for their willingness to come forward and share their stories, because it really does help in building awareness to have people like them that have experienced commercial sexual exploitation to come out and speak about it. So big shout out to them. Of the two people that were highlighted in Unseen in this two-part series, one of them, Chris Bates is a white individual. Jose Alfaro is a Mexican American. And so the reason why I mention their races is because you talked about how Black and brown people are people that are at greater risk to experience commercial sexual exploitation. And I'm just wondering if you can talk to some of the data showing that this is the case.
Sure, absolutely. Jose Alfaro essentially led us through spoke about his story, and it was a narrative. It was a way of understanding how Black and brown boys are impacted disproportionately by human trafficking. And much of it is, of course, economically determined. Human traffickers prey on the most vulnerable. And the most vulnerable in our country tend to be the poor in general, but also the most vulnerable tend to be those who are impacted by racism and discrimination. They are Black and brown people, and Black and brown boys in the context of this study and information. We looked, for example, at one study carried out by Lori Schaffner, a University of Illinois professor emeritus, and she was tasked with basically looking at who in Chicago made up the vast majority of people who were sexually exploited among men. And what she found was that 58% of the sex trade period were involved male youth, biological male youth, and that the vast majority of them in Chicago were Black and brown, selling their bodies in exchange for a roof over their heads or food on their plates or to make a living. And she essentially looked at what were the reasons for this. Well, systemic racism that resulted in poverty, extreme unemployment. That is to say, almost unemployable, not because quite often that they're sub-education, though that is a factor, but more often because of who they were and where they came from. Some of the most impoverished areas of Chicago. And then, of course, a major factor is housing discrimination, which compelled many of these young men to trade sex for survival. And Schaffner found that she spoke to a number of people who participated in this study. And how she got them to participate in the study was that, of course, she offered money to those who were trafficked, because people don't come forward. Especially boys and men, they do not come forward to talk about being trafficked. But she went into parks and said that, and other places, into homeless shelters, and found a number of boys and men who said that men came up to them, offered them money, and in exchange for that money, they had sex. Now, some of these boys and young men were straight, ostensibly. But they said they participated in gay sex for money. And again, as in Chicago, an extraordinary percentage were as much as 58% of those involved in the sex trade, according to this study, were boys. Now, we also found that I'm looking at the stats on the Chicago sex trade study, and that 80% of them were Black, African American, 7% Latino. Depending on where you go, that's a very high percentage. In Chicago, had the highest percentage. But you also find a high percentage of exploited individuals and an extraordinary percentage of them being boys out of the Atlanta, Georgia area as well.
And if you look at the case with Jose Alfaro, to drive home that point that Black and brown boys and young men are disproportionately at risk, in Jose Alfaro's case, there were 3 out of the 4 documented victims who experienced commercial sexual exploitation at the hands of the perpetrator, Jason Gandy. 3 of the 4 were Latino. Is that
That's
correct?
right. That's right. I think, Garrett, just for a second, more about the Jason Gandy case. Gandy was someone who was convicted in a well-known federal case in 2018. He was convicted of prostituting, trafficking Jose Alfaro and others, including the other Latino boys you just mentioned. How Alfaro came to know him, it's fairly typical in the way these things happen. When they discovered that he was gay, they said, you either go to conversion therapy or you're out of here. He, over a period of time, he thought, well, I'll try conversion therapy. And then he realized, well, that's not something that can possibly work. So he basically called it a day and said, I cannot do this because it is not me. He was kicked out, and in having no place to go, he looked through I think it's called .com, a website. And this is how a lot of the quote unquote hookups occur, through websites. And he found the person who responded to him was a fellow named Jason Gandy. Gandy told him when he took him to his home that in order for him to stay there, he's going to have to work. And the work that he wanted him to do was to work as a masseuse. And Alfaro told GBH, told us, well, I can do that. I can learn to do that. And so, but what he was taught, however, was to give sexual massage. And one thing led to another until he was finally raped during one of these sessions. And that is also when he had that moment where he felt, I have to leave. He, however, did not leave the sex trade, as it's called. A lot of people don't like that term, but for lacking another term, he did not leave the sex trade. He, for a long time, traded sex for something of value that included money, shelter, and food. And he eventually ended up in Boston, the courtesy of a quote-unquote sugar daddy. And it was here in Boston where he fell in love with someone and abandoned his life of trading sex for something of value. By that time, he was about 21, 22 years old. But this began with his exploitation by Jason Gandy when he had just turned 16.
And I think that a layperson may not know that, individuals experiencing, because in Jose Alfaro's case, because he was kicked out of his house, he was then experiencing homelessness. And I think that a layperson, we don't realize that individuals experiencing homelessness are at greater risk for this type of thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's you hit the nail on the head. Polaris, again, the think tank that's focused on stopping human trafficking based in Washington, D.C., finds that it is it is an acute factor in determining who will be exploited, who will be sexually exploited. Homelessness, of course, leads to foster care. Foster care, under most circumstances, works out for a number of youth, but others, it simply doesn't. When they get out of foster care and have nowhere to go, oftentimes it leads to their exploitation. Sometimes that exploitation takes place, of course, as we know, within foster care. But I don't think we should exaggerate the number of cases where that is applicable, though it is significant. But homelessness leaves youth particularly vulnerable to commercial sexual exploitation. There was a 2016 national study conducted by the Federal Administration for Children and Families that found a large number of kids had traded, again, something of value, including had traded sex for something of value that included money, shelter, and food. These researchers spoke to 873 young people, boys, ages 14 to 21, in 11 cities that included Boston for the study. And again, found that a significant number were boys and trans females. And by the way, Garrett, our next two series deal with the internet and the role that the internet plays, and two, it focuses on trans females who are perhaps the greatest victims disproportionately. And so that particular complex situation has also led to a complex way of approaching the trafficking of trans females.
Right. And I think it's safe to say that things like transphobia, homophobia, other stigmas, shame, all these things increase the likelihood of victimization or continued victimization.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct.
You know, I know we only have a few minutes before you have to jump off. Because we only have a couple minutes left, I just want to ask, in your opinion, what can be done to fight commercial sexual exploitation?
I think the first thing is to acknowledge it. And that is to say, let's engage it realistically. That sexual commercial exploitation is real. It is exacerbated by the internet, without question. And among its victims are boys and young men. And so let's first of all acknowledge that. You may not hear about it as much, but it is a fact. And again, you do not hear about it as much, largely because the boys and young men, because of shame, they don't want folks to know that they've been exploited. But what we can do is to understand that this goes on and to help individuals who may be impacted by this. And how do we find out if no one is telling? We basically talk with legitimate organizations like the Polaris group and local organizations that are focused on human trafficking. And so acknowledgement, Garrett, is the first thing. The second thing is to engage those organizations that are working to eliminate human trafficking in all its forms, including the super exploitation of boys and young men. And of course, not everything is in the context of trafficking. There are other forms of sexual exploitation that occurs that may not involve money, but does involve, again, trading sex for something of value other than money that might include just a couch or place to stay overnight.
Right. As I was preparing for the conversation today, I couldn't help but think about Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And just knowing I know that oftentimes it can be, criticized for being oversimplified, but I think it can be a helpful tool to understand human motivation. And these individuals who often are experiencing or get into the life of sex trafficking or brought into the life of sex trafficking, it's because some of those basic human needs are not being met. And therefore, just like you mentioned, it's referred to as survival sex.
That's right. And that's a good reference because just think about what you would do or wouldn't do in order to survive. And I'm not talking about you, Garrett. I'm just talking about our audience. What would folks do to survive? And we don't know. We don't know until we are basically put into that, to that test.
Right.
There are things we say to ourselves that we would never do, but you never know. And that's why those things have to be, the conditions that breed desperation have to be addressed if we are to deal effectively with human trafficking. Housing has to be addressed effectively, as does the type of systems that exist in many states that are woefully inadequate in addressing the needs of children, boys and girls, for that matter, are often underserved, and a lot of that has to do with the lack of money. We commit money for all types of things, so we have to put money into housing and to taking care of our youngest members of our society in order to prevent the desperation that occurs at a later age and the exploitation that occurs at an early age and continues for many of these young people through life.
Right. Well, we want to thank you for the investigation that you have performed, your continued efforts to investigate this. We also want to thank GBH News. Before our time has expired, we're actually 1 minute over. Is there anything you'd like to mention before ending the conversation?
Garrett, I just want to say, I think it's really vitally important that you are doing exactly what you're doing, keeping a focus on the pernicious impact of certain images in our society that continue basically to undermine of reality, basically, and how we look at girls, how we look at boys, how we look at each other. That imagery is vital and important of negative influences for human trafficking, because it basically presents a picture of what of someone's concept of what a boy should be, or what a man should be, or what a woman should be, primarily, and girls. It basically strips away dignity. So what you're doing, I think, is performing an important service.
Well, we appreciate that. Yeah, that's part of our mission statement, is to fight exploitation through education, and so that's the goal. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to part 3 of this series.
Thank you, Garrett. Yeah, part 3, again, will focus on the internet. Part 4, we're looking at the exploitation of trans youth. And at some point in our series of Unseen, we'll be talking about American travelers to places like Thailand, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and other countries who sexually exploit boys and teens there. And we're looking, this includes a recent report that offers a glimpse into that world put out by a group called ECPAT.
Well, maybe in the future we can connect again as this series continues to unfold. We can connect again to chat about these other aspects of the issue.
Okay. Thank you, Garrett.
Looking for a way to spread awareness on the harms of porn? Why not rep the movement in one of our conversation starting tees? With over 20 tees in various designs and phrases, you're bound to find something that speaks to you and will spark conversations with others. And the proceeds help to mobilize this movement. Get your gear today at ftnd.org/shop. That's ftnd.org/SHOP.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Consider Before Consuming. Consider Before Consuming is brought to you by Fight the New Drug. Fight the New Drug is a non-religious and non-legislative organization that exists to provide individuals the opportunity to make an informed decision regarding pornography by raising awareness on its harmful effects using only science, facts, and personal accounts. If you want to learn more about today's guest and the conversation we had, you can check out the links included with this episode. Again, big thanks to you for listening to this conversation. As you go about your day, we invite you to increase your self-awareness, look both ways, check your blind spots, and consider before consuming.